Hello, it's me, Chili, and today I'll be discussing the history of child labor. I've heard this child labor thing from a Minecraft YouTuber named Fingees, and since it's related to his content, we will be learning about the history of child labor. Let's prevent child labor because children deserves to be happy. Every child deserves to be happy. Let's not put the children in trauma and in depression. Let kids act as kids. Let kids go on the path of their childhood, which is being a kid. And here we are. I'll be reading right now. Child labor, or the use of children as workers, servants, and apprentices, has been practiced throughout most of human history, but reaches its zenith during the Industrial Revolution. Miserable working conditions, including crowded and clean factories, a lack of safety codes, and long hours were the norm. Children could be paid less and were less likely to organize into unions. Working children were typically unable to attend school, creating a cycle of poverty that was difficult to break. 19th century reformers and labor organizers sought to restrict child labor and improve working conditions to uplift the masses, but it took the Great Depression, a time when Americans were desperate for employment, to shake long-held practices of child labor in the United States. Right. Now let's move on to the child labor in the United States. The Puritan work ethic of the 30 colonies in their founders valued hard work over idleness, and this ethos applied to children is as well. To the first half of the 1800s, child labor was an essential part of the agricultural and handicap economy of the United States. Children worked as family farms and as indentured servants for others. To learn a trade, boys often began their apprenticeships between the ages of 10 and 14. Now let's move on to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution saw the rise of factories and mines in needs of workers. They were ideal employees because they could be paid less, were often of smaller size, so could attend to tasks in time spaces, and were less likely to organize a strike against their pitiable working conditions. Before the Civil War, but they played a critical role in American manufacturing. It was still a relatively small part of the economy, and advances in manufacturing techniques after the war increased the numbers of jobs and therefore increased the number of child laborers. Now let's move on to immigration and child labor. Immigration to the United States coincidentally peaked during the Industrial Revolution and led to a new sense of labor and child labor when the Irish potato famine struck in the 1840s. Irish immigrants moved to fill lower-level factory jobs. In the 1880s, groups from Southern and Eastern Europe arrived, provided the new pool of child workers. The trend continues today as many immigrant children work in agriculture, which is exempt from certain labor laws. Now let's move on to National Child Labor Committee. Educational reformers of the mid-19th century attempted to convince the public that the primary school education was a necessity if the nation were to advance as a whole. Several states established a minimum wage for labor and requirements for school attendance, though many of these laws were full of loopholes that were readily exploited by employers hungry for cheap labor. Beginning in 1900, efforts to regulate or eliminate child labor became central to social reform in the United States. The National Child Labor Committee, organized in 1904, and state child labor committees led the charge. These organizations employ flexible methods in the face of slow progress. They paranoid tactics like investigations by experts. The use of photographs of child labor to spark outrage of the poor conditions of children at work and persuasive lobbying efforts. They use written leaflets and mass mailings to reach the public. From 1902 to 1915, child labor committees emphasized reforms to state legislatures. Many laws restricting child labor were passed as part of the progressive era reform movement, but many southern states resisted, leading to the decision to work for a federal child labor law. While Congress passed such laws in 1916 and 1918, the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. The supporters of child labor laws sought a constitutional amendment authorizing federal child labor legislation, and it passed in 1924. Two states will not need to ratify it. The conservative political climate of the 1930s, together with opposition from farm and church organizations, will increase federal power over children, acted as roadblocks. Now let's move on to Depression-era child labor. The Great Depression left thousands of Americans without jobs and led to sweeping reforms under the New Deal programs of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This focused on increasing federal oversight at the workplace and giving out of work adult jobs, thereby creating a powerful motive to remove children from the workforce. Almost all of the codes developed under the National Industrial Recovery Act served to reduce child labor. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set a national minimum wage for the first time maximum number of hours for workers in interstate commerce and placed limitations on child labor. In effect, thus, employment of child under 16 years of age was prohibited in manufacturing and mining. Now let's move on to automatization and education. Changing attitudes toward work and social reform weren't the only factors reducing child labor. The invention of improved machinery and mechanized many of the repetitive tasks previously given to
educated children led to a decrease of children in the workforce. Semi-skilled adults took their place for more complex tasks. Education underwent efforts to many states, increasing the number of years of schooling required to hold certain jobs, lengthened the school year, and began to more strictly enforce truancy laws. In 1949, Congress amended the child labor law to include business not covered in 1938, like transportation, communications, and public utilities. Now let's move on to, does child labor exist today? Although child labor has been significantly called in the United States, it lingers in certain areas of the economy like agriculture, where migrant workers are more difficult to regulate. Since 1938, federal laws have excluded child from workers from labor protections provided to other working children. For example, children 12 and younger can legally work in farm fields despite the risk posed by exposure to pesticides and farm machinery. Employees in the garment industry have turned to the children of illegal immigrants in an effort to compete with imports from low-wage nations. Despite law limiting the number of hours of work for children and teens still attending school, the increasing cost of education means many are working longer hours to make ends meet. State-by-state enforcement of child labor laws varies to this day. Well, that is all. That's all for the history of child labor. The website of everything I have read is from history.com. Go search for it. Now let's end child labor because it still exists. This is child abuse. So we must end child labor. Let the children be happy. Let the children go to school. Let the children grow up into a wonderful life. Let's not make the past continue. Let's end that past. Let's end that cycle so that the children will no longer have such trauma in their lives. So let's be considerate. Get rid of child labor, and then all these children will be alright. Let's make sure that the new generation wouldn't experience such horrible such horrible history. Let's make sure those children will never experience those. The new children in the new generation will no longer experience those. Let's make sure of that. So let's end child labor. And that is all. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this video. And due to the reaction video next week, please check on Fingees' content. He's a Minecraft YouTuber. Fingees YT is his username. I'll put his name in the description. Until next time, bye-bye!